But who would the victim of domestic violence call if the abuser was one of us? How would your agency respond to a family violence call in our family? Victims of police-perpetrated domestic violence often have no one to turn to. They suffer the same shame, pain, and trauma as civilian victims, but they're further victimized by a system that often protects the offender rather than the victim. In order for victims of domestic violence to trust us, we have to prove to them the criminal justice system will keep them safe and hold the offenders accountable. How can we convince the public to trust us if we won't hold our own accountable for the same crimes? I want you to meet a woman who was a victim of police-perpetrated domestic violence over 35 years ago. She was so traumatized, even today, she doesn't want to show her face in this video, so we put her face in the shadows. This is the voice of a fellow police officer.
Just regularly, I had a loaded gun put in my face, and normally he would be drunk at the time that happened. And it got to the point where I just, it was like, God, just let me die, let him kill me, and I'll be out of this misery. That was the only way I ever thought I would be out of it. When I went to work, he would be just driving by. If I went to the grocery store, he would drive through the parking lot. It even got to the point where he stood outside my bedroom window and watched me, and I let him. I didn't realize that, I could do anything about it. He said he was a police officer, and who was I going to call, because he knew all the police officers. He said he knew all the judges, he knew all the attorneys. There was nothing I could do. Nobody was going to do anything to him.
When did you realize you were a victim of domestic violence?
Well, actually, I was a police officer at that time, just starting out, and I had been sent by my department to a domestic violence training program. And during that program, they had the wheel, the violence wheel, and that's when I sat there and realized that that was me, that he had me controlled for all those years. The only thing was, he never went through the honeymoon stage. He never apologized for anything he did, because he never thought he did anything wrong. It would just escalate and then de-escalate and escalate and de-escalate.
Well, was there one incident, one violent moment that convinced you it was time for it to be over with?
It was his decision. He made all the decisions to move out. He made the decision when to get the divorce. But before he moved out, there was one night that he was really drunk, and he decided that I was going to stab him, and my hands were going to be on the knife, and then that way I would be in trouble. He wanted me to give him the kids, and I wouldn't do it. He was a very large man. He wore a size 15 ring, so he was strong. He put my hand around a big knife and put his hands around mine and tried to make me stab him. And again, only by the grace of God was I able to hold that off, and it didn't stab him. And that was kind of when it ended. Shortly after that, he moved out.
Was there ever a time when you thought, I will call his supervisor, I will call his supervisor?
I never thought I had that option.
And obviously it was fear of retaliation from him if you called.
Yes. When I was going through the police academy, we had joint custody of our children. When I was going through the police academy, he kept telling me the whole time that he was going to make sure I didn't pass, because that was a contingency, for me having the job. And while I was at the academy, he had papers served on me there, trying to get full custody of my children. Just anything that was a control tactic.
You've been a police officer over 20 years now.
Yes.
And you've handled domestic violence situations.
Yes.
What's the difference between, in your opinion, the standard call that we answer of a civilian and a wife of a police officer? Not only that, a police officer who's a wife of a police officer. What's the difference between the two?
I think it's the secrecy. You're so conditioned to keep everything a secret that happens in your house, and it's not going to be discussed. And I know wives that are controlled and battered will not discuss situations, but I think it's even more of a secret when it involves a police officer.
Let me ask you, we've obscured your face for this film. Why did you want to be in the shadows?
Because he's still alive. He's retired, but there's still officers that know him, officers that know me, that worked with him.
You got an opportunity to say whatever you want to say. What should happen?
I think training is a big part of it. What to expect. I know I've been in training sessions where we've had domestic violence, and I've had to sit in a room with officers and say, why didn't they just leave? Why didn't they just leave? It's not that easy. And of course, I couldn't open my mouth then, but I hope this training will help, because you can't just leave. I had children. I had no job. I was staying home with children. I was controlled. I didn't have a vehicle. Where was I going to go?
So which means there's still some attitude problems in our ranks about violence against women, and certainly in the police family too. That's sort of a taboo. That's not talked about that much, is it?
No, it's not. It's being a police officer, of course, living with one and then being one, there is a certain amount of secrecy. You can't trust people. You can't talk to people. It's just like their own little brotherhood.
Dottie Davis has had a successful career in law enforcement for over 25 years. Currently, she's the Deputy Chief of the Fort Wayne, Indiana Police Department. As a survivor, Dottie's made it her life's mission to speak out against officer-involved domestic violence and to educate us about this violent crime. She's had to deal with the impact of abuse not only on her personal life, but on her professional life as well. Dottie's ex-husband, a fellow police officer, was her abuser.
Our relationship wasn't physically violent initially. It wasn't until I joined a neighboring police department where the very first physical violence occurred, and I remember it very clearly because it was over whose agency was better.
So you were an officer for a different agency?
Yes, I was. And he leg swept me to the floor and pinned me with his forearm across my chest. And the next day, it was just textbook. There was a card on my windshield at the academy saying how sorry he was and how much he loved me, and that he wanted to work on the relationship. And I thought that was very honest and that he really was sincere. 6 years I stayed with him, and over the 6 years I realized that he had a certain method of operation, just like our other perpetrators do, that he would actually use my career in law enforcement as a means in which to get me to engage him physically.
So the tactics you learned as a recruit to be an officer and later learn as an officer, you saw in him, and you saw the same tactics in him? Absolutely.
He would get into my space. He would begin to push me in the chest. He would taunt me and say, show me what they taught you. You do a man's job. Show me what they taught you. Can you defend yourself? And then the tapping in the face and the shoving in the chest and pinning me against the wall would begin. And I had two choices: to either physically engage him or to walk away and feel emotionally battered because I was pathetic and weak, and you don't deserve to be in law enforcement.
Completely opposite of the way you're trained to, is to face a challenge like that. He was hoping that you would, I guess.
Exactly. But if I did physically engage him, then my injuries would either be too obvious to a parent or too severe that I wouldn't be able to report for duty. So he won no matter what. So
there was a resistance for you to report because of what? I mean, why didn't you report to your supervisors?
I came on the department in 1981, and at that time the fear was not that he would be in trouble for the physical violence. It was that I would be in trouble and I would lose my job, because if I couldn't defend myself in my own home, how could I protect other people out there on the street or fellow officers? So I would be looked at as though I needed to go, I was less than.
Was there ever a time when you thought, I'm going to call 911, that's it, I'm going to, or did you think about it and then didn't do it? And if you didn't, why didn't you call 911?
Actually, I did dial 911 in one of the very severe cases where he caused quite a bit of physical damage to me. And I did call 911, and his agency responded to our home. And at that time, it was prior to the laws being enacted across the country for law enforcement officers to be able to effect an arrest without the victim's consent.
Before mandatory arrest laws.
Correct. And so the officers did what they thought was the best thing to do, and that was to write no reports, to destroy all record that anyone had ever been dispatched there, and to swear each other to secrecy. The day he almost killed me was the day the sheriff's office served him with his divorce papers. I didn't know the sheriff's department served people in our county with the papers. And he was so enraged because he was shamed by the sheriff's office coming to him and serving him these papers that he came immediately to the house. See, when he told me he was leaving, I thought that meant we're done. But now I understand that that meant I'm leaving, I'm in charge, I say when this is over. That day he came to the house and I was in full police uniform. And I mean, Mark, I was just snapping my keepers on my gun belt. And I heard the front door of the house open, And my stomach just was in knots because I knew he's the only other person who had keys to the house. And here I am in full uniform, and I'm running down the hallway trying to get out the back door of the house before he could find me. And he came into the kitchen and caught me in the laundry room area. And it was so typical. He caught me by the back of the head and dragged me back into the kitchen and slammed me against the wall, and had the paper in his hand, and his body was up against me, and he was so angry he was spitting in my face and asking me what these effing papers were, and drops the papers and begins to strangle me with his hands. It wasn't the first time that he'd ever strangled me. But the look on his face, the intenseness, I was so petrified of what was going to happen. People ask me all the time, well, why didn't you shoot him? You had your gun on you. Honestly, we talk about our police training, and you talk about that continuum of force. You don't escalate just to your gun initially. I don't know, I realized that he had me against a wall with a telephone hanging on it, and so I grabbed the receiver and hit him as hard as I could in his eye orbit. And he let go of my throat and grabbed his face. And I ran out the back door of the house in full police uniform. His squad car is in the driveway, and I'm telling the neighbor lady to call the police. I'm the police, and so is he.
You are a professional woman, you're law enforcement, you have power, but in this situation, he had all the power.
He had a lot of power. He certainly had the brotherhood of support, and also the code of silence. You don't rat on other officers.
Right.
You don't tell on them. And back in the 80s, there weren't standards and policies, and people weren't talking about domestic violence within law enforcement families.
What's it going to take to change this culture of calling a crime a crisis?
We need to educate and do trainings so that it's not a secret. That's the only way we're going to change the culture, is if we call it what it is, talk about how it is controlled by law enforcement. And it is. It's confined within our doors of our police stations, and until we admit that it's a problem and talk about what are the solvability factors and move forward, nothing's going to change.
So the very people who we work with day in and day out, who are offenders, not only commit crimes against their family members, they chip away at our integrity as a family, as a police family, and our profession as law enforcement. Is that what you're saying?
They tarnish our badges. It's a noble profession, but I truly believe that one bad apple can make everybody in blue or brown or whatever the color of the uniform is look bad.
What do you think that it does to the morale of a police department when we don't hold our own accountable for family violence?
Within my agency, I can see that it's caused a great division. It's caused a division amongst the officers who know this other officer was guilty, should have been held accountable, and should no longer be wearing the uniform and working beside them on investigations. And it causes a division between the patrol officers and the command, because they look to them for guidance, they look to them for equality, that everybody's going to be treated the same, and they know that's not true. And how can we as police officers expect our citizens to trust us and respect us, and for us to have any honor amongst ourselves if we don't police our own?
So we've got to be honest and admit we've got a problem in the ranks about domestic violence, wouldn't you say?
We got to talk about it. We've got to acknowledge it. We have to admit that it's going on, and we have to do something about it. Okay, we've been talking about it for approximately 10 years now. There's great model policies out there. There are agencies that have adopted policies, but it's time that we enforce them. It's time that we hold people accountable, and it's time that we weed out those officers who are perpetrating this against their significant others.